I have the honor of introducing my good friend, David Thaler. And if you just take a look at all the post-nominal initials after his name, you can see the challenge I have introducing this man in just a few minutes. Putting his engineering credentials aside for a minute, he has published 5 books of literary criticism, and based on one, he gave the H.L. Mencken Memorial Lecture in 2015. He also holds Maryland's highest military honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, as well as the Militia Medal Bronze Star. He was the founding president of the Land Development Council of Maryland, and he has served as chair of the Baltimore County Chamber of Commerce. Returning to his engineering accomplishments, David is the managing principal of D.S. Thaler and Associates, LLC, a civil environmental engineering firm that he founded in 1976. Now, in 2019, he won the award as the top professional engineer in the United States. I just blows my mind every time I think about it. He has also received countless other lifetime achievement awards and holds Maryland's highest professional engineering award, now simply just known as the Thaler Prize. I could go on, but I want to point out just one thing, because it's actually directly related to his presentation today. And that is that David made a documentary with Mark Knopfler. Yes, Mark Knopfler, the former singer, songwriter, lead guitarist for Dire Straits. Isn't that cool? And we all know, Sultans of Swing, but they also wrote a song called Sailing to Philadelphia about the Mason-Dixon line. And so David can tell you a little bit more about that documentary, but you have to watch it because it's really cool and it's so interesting. You can find it on YouTube just by typing in Mason-Dixon line and Sailing to Philadelphia. Now, finally, on a more personal note, David is married to my dear friend, Carolyn Thaler, who has left her own mark in the area of family law. And I will share with you that, let's see if I can get the picture up here. Oh, I can't show you the picture, darn, but I can't do it because David has a slide up on the screen. But what I was going to show you was a picture of David from my wedding, because he performed at my wedding, because he is also, among all of his other talents, a professional bagpiper. But anyway, so now I present to you the man who, like the stargazing baker's boy from West County, England, country England, joined the Royal Society and realized very big dreams. David Thaler.
Well, Judge Leahy, thank you so very much for that very kind introduction. My mother would have been so proud. But I know that in my obituary, it's going to read that I was the only man who didn't wear his trousers at your wedding because I was in the kilt and I was the bagpiper. But thank you very much. And thank you to the Bar Association for inviting me to give this talk. So what I really want to do is tell you that I've been on a great adventure, and I want to share it with you by telling you a story. So get comfortable, get an adult beverage if you would like, relax, and I want to tell you a story. But it's really multiple stories in one. First, it's the story of the granddaddy of all title disputes. Second, it's the story of the greatest scientific and engineering achievement of the American Enlightenment in the 18th century and the very first geodetic survey in the New World. And it's also the story of the rather improbable discovery, or perhaps rediscovery, of America's most historic scientific instrument. And finally, it's the story of how, with a little luck and persistence, even a perfectly ordinary person can have an extraordinary adventure. But the story began for me when several years ago, the Walters Art Museum had a wonderful map exhibition, and the other cultural institutions were asked to participate. And the Maryland Historical Society, now known as the Maryland Center for History and Culture, but for simplicity, I'm going to continue to call it the Historical Society, of which I was then the president-elect, asked me if I thought we should display this map. And when I saw it, it's about 6 foot long, it's parchment, and I said, oh my God, for a surveyor like me, I was gobsmacked. My eyes bugged out of my head. They almost had to scrape me off the floor. It's the original map of the Mason-Dixon survey, signed and sealed by the 12 boundary commissioners. It's one of only 3 such, I didn't know it at the time, but it's one of only 3 known to exist. And for me, a surveyor, it was like finding the Holy Grail. And I said, what else you got? And I became aware that deep in the Society's vaults were stored many of the original documents related to the 80-year boundary dispute between Maryland and Pennsylvania and the artifacts and documents of the Mason-Dixon survey. I then went on a hunt to see what else we could find, and it was like something out of an Indiana Jones or a National Treasure movie. I said to the Historical Society that we had to have, they had all this stuff down there nobody knew about. We had to have this exhibition, and a friend of mine sent me this a picture. And he said, I think this is the instrument used by Mason and Dixon. For on a table on the 2nd floor in Independence Hall, completely unrecognized and unappreciated, was this curious object. And it turns out to be America's most historic scientific instrument. It's a great story, and I really want to share it with you today. But our tale begins with Sir George Calvert, a Catholic who was the Secretary of State to the Protestant King James I of England. Sir George had the unenviable task of shepherding the king's anti-Catholic measures through Parliament, and for his loyal service to the crown, he was created Lord Baltimore, a baron in the Irish peerage, and he was also granted land in the New World. He was first given a colony named Avalon up in Newfoundland, but he found the weather there too unpleasant. And so he petitioned King George at the time. Bear with me one moment. I'm having a little computer spaz. He would next tried Jamestown, but he was not accepted to his Catholicism, and so he petitioned Charles I, who had succeeded to the throne for a province in America, which he named Maryland in honor of Henrietta Marietta, the consort to the king. And on July 20th, 1632, the Royal Charter granted to Lord Baltimore all that territory from the Atlantic Ocean unto the true meridian of the first fountain of the river Potomac, and from the south bank of the Potomac River to include all land which lieth under the 40th degree of north latitude. Now notice the grant, go back one, Abby. Now notice the grant was from the south bank of the Potomac River. Now this has been the subject of several cases that wound their way to the Supreme Court because the grant was not to the center or the thoweg of the Potomac River, it was to the south bank. So all discharges from Virginia, Maryland argued that should come under Maryland permitting, and there have been at least 2, possibly 3 cases that made it to the Supreme Court to decide that issue. Next one, Abby. But the other player in our tale is Sir William Penn, who had been a distinguished admiral in the Royal Navy during the Dutch Wars. He had loaned the profligate King Charles II the then stupendous sum of 16,000 pounds sterling. In exchange for discharging the debt, his son, also William, was granted the province of Pennsylvania. Now, Penn was given all the land for 5 degrees of longitude west of the Delaware River, from the 42nd parallel of latitude down to the 40th. excluding a 12-mile circle around Newcastle in what's now Delaware. So Calvert, the proprietor of Maryland, got from the Potomac to the 40th parallel, and Penn, the proprietor of Pennsylvania, got from the 42nd to the 40th parallel, where it intersected the circle 12 miles from Newcastle. But the question was, where was the 40th parallel? Now, unfortunately, the maps at the time were based upon the exploration of the Chesapeake region made by Captain John Smith in 1608 and first published in 1613 in his General History of Virginia. This particular slide happens to be David Scheffernacker's copy, who many of you may know him. He has a fabulous antique book collection. But the Smith map, next one, Abby, but the Smith map showed the 40th parallel too far south. Stay there for a second. Now, this is the very famous map that accompanied John Smith's 1608 explorations. Now, you'll notice it's turned so that west is north. Now, this was basically an advertising map that they tried to get investors in England, and this is the direction that you would approach when sailing from England. But if you look at the slide on the right, I have circled the 40th parallel. And if you look carefully, it's right at the top of the Chesapeake Bay, about where Elkton is today, and this is way too far south. And in fact, the 40th parallel does not intersect a 12-mile circle around Newcastle, and it lies much further north. And it was this discrepancy, really shown clearly on this map, that set off the greatest boundary dispute of them all, which it was the longest running case in British judicial history, Jarndyce versus Jarndyce notwithstanding, and it raged for more than 80 years. Now, the dispute was so bitter because the stakes were so high. There was a tremendous amount of territory in question, about 4,000 square miles, and furthermore, Philadelphia was settled at the limit of navigability of the Delaware River and lay about 5 miles south of the 40th parallel. Now, depending on the location of its border, Pennsylvania could have lost both Philadelphia and its all-important access to the sea and resupply. It was also unclear to whom taxes were due, and disputes. Whoop, hang on with me. It was also unclear to whom taxes were due, and violence also broke out regularly along the border. In one famous case, Colonel Thomas Cressup, a Maryland partisan, operated a ferry on the Susquehanna in what is now Pennsylvania. And after confiscating land from Maryland and refusing to pay taxes in what became known as Cressup's War, he was arrested and dragged through the streets of Philadelphia, where he is reported to have exclaimed, "Damn, this is one of the prettiest towns in Maryland." Now, to settle the question, the Calvert suggested simply sailing up the Delaware until the 40th parallel could be determined with the sextants. But the Penns, on the other hand, argued that their southern border should be no farther south than 12 miles north of Newcastle. And finally, in 1732, the parties entered into an agreement. They agreed that the boundary should be run 15 miles south of Philadelphia, and I've sort of drawn it on this slide. This became known as the east-west line, and west from Cape Henlopen on Fenwick Island to the midpoint of the Delaware Peninsula, which became known as the Transpeninsular Line, and then north to intersect the tangent with the 12-mile arc around Newcastle, which became known as the Tangent Line. Now, this is the actual exhibit which accompanied the agreement. It's here in Baltimore, in the basement of the Maryland Historical Society, and the red line is reported to have been drawn by Lord Baltimore himself. Now, this was not a good deal for the Calverts. It placed the boundary about 19 miles south of the 40th parallel, and the controversy raged on. Now, the parties could not come to a resolution, and finally, in 1735, the Penns filed a bill of complaint for specific performance in the English courts, which became known as the Great Chancery Suit. This is the actual brief. It's in about 12 volumes. It's right here in Baltimore, as filed in the Court of Chancery in London. Now, you'll notice that the stenographers of those, you notice how far apart the words are. And it's clear that the stenographers in those days, much like today, got paid by the words. And that's why there's so few words on the page, and it goes on for so many volumes. But the case was litigated over 15 years at enormous expense until in 1750, the Earl Hardwicke, the Lord Chancellor, rendered a decision. And he ordered that the southern boundary of the lower three counties of Pennsylvania, now Delaware, would be at the latitude of Cape Henlopen, and the peninsula would be divided equally. The center of the 12-mile circle was to be measured as a radius from the center of Newcastle, which the parties agreed would be the dome of the Newcastle courthouse. And the east-west line would be run at a constant parallel of latitude, exactly 15 miles south of the southernmost point at the time in the city of Philadelphia. Now, the proprietors appointed 6 boundary commissioners, 6 from Pennsylvania and 6 from Maryland, and they engaged local surveyors. And the surveyors started with the Transpeninsular line on April 26, 1751. And they began on Fenwick Island and ran their line across the peninsula. Don't change the slide on this one, Abby. From the verge of the Atlantic Ocean to the Chesapeake Bay. Now, this is the actual stone that they set. It's right here in front of the Fenwick Island courthouse. It's still there, lighthouse, I mean. And on your trips to Ocean City or Rehoboth, you may very well see this. Okay, Abby. Although swamps and dense vegetation made work on the Transpeninsular line difficult, and there was much bickering between the parties, the colonial surveyors were able to find and mark the midpoint of the peninsula, which became known as the southwestern corner of what's now Delaware. And if driving to Ocean City, if you drive past, this is what the corner looks like. And on December 13, 1760, the colonial surveyors tackled the task of running the tangent line. And the line from the midpoint of the peninsula to the tangency with the 12-mile circle around Newcastle. Now, this was a lot harder than it looked. Bear with me. Because and here is, we've created a diagram of it. So they had to start below the bottom of the slide at the midpoint of the Delmarva Peninsula, and they had to run 61 miles north and hit right on a 12-mile circle measured from Newcastle. Now, this was pretty easy to draw on a piece of paper with a rule and a compass, but it was really hard to do through the swamps of the eastern shore. This would be a challenging task even today. Then the colonial surveyors ran their line from the midpoint until it was within the 12-mile circle, and then they measured from the dome of the courthouse and tried to adjust to the tangent point. But their first attempt was a half mile too far east. And this is the actual sketch from Mason and Dixon's journal of their attempts to hit the tangent. The journal, I'll tell you the story later, but the journal happens to be in the Maryland archives here in Annapolis. 2 other attempts were too far west, and the field notes of 2 of the 3 attempts by the surveyors are at the Maryland Historical Society. Amazingly enough, the field notes of the third attempt came up for auction in San Diego. A friend of mine called me, let me know about it, and I bought it and have it. And in time, it will join its brothers at the Maryland Historical Society. Now, as the task seemed beyond the capability of the local surveyors, the Penns and the Calverts consulted the Astronomer Royal for suggestions of surveyors who could complete the task. Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon were recommended. Dixon was an experienced surveyor from County Durham in northeastern England, and Mason had been an assistant at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. They had worked together on the famous transit of Venus observation of 1761. And the transit of Venus is an astronomical phenomenon that occurs every 121 years and then twice 8 years apart. As Venus crosses or transits the face of the sun, taking measurements from different points on the Earth allows the solar parallax, the distance from the Earth to the sun, and the size of the solar system to be calculated. This, of course, was the Enlightenment, the age of reason, and determining the size of the solar system was the burning question. The last transit of Venus, you can stay there, Abby, occurred about 10 years ago. And I hope I went out to see it. I hope everybody went out to see it, because otherwise you'll have to wait for another 110 years for the next one. But Mason and Dixon, go to the contract. Mason and Dixon entered into a contract with the proprietors. This is the actual contract for the Mason-Dixon survey. It's signed by Cecilia Calvert, the Lord Baltimore, Thomas and Richard Penn, Charles Mason, and Jeremiah Dixon, who have affixed their seals to the bottom. It's about 3 by 3, and it's exactly like a surveying contract we would do today. It's time and material plus expenses, and it's right here in Baltimore. So in any event, the boys entered into a contract with the proprietors, and they arrived in Philadelphia on November 15, 1763. And they had brought with them state-of-the-art equipment, specially made for the Penns by the most famous instrument maker of the 18th century. His name was John Bird, and these were the instruments with which they were going to perform their task. These included a zenithsector, which was the most advanced instrument for determining latitude of the day, and it's a 6-foot telescope mounted on a 6-foot radius protractor scale used to determine latitude. You had to sit there on the bottom, and you had to look up through it, and you were able to determine latitude with this instrument. They also brought a Hadley quadrant, which is actually an octant, and it's used in celestial navigation and can measure angles up to 90 degrees. And they also brought a transit and equal altitude instrument. This looks like a transit, but it isn't. It's a different kind of instrument. And this is used to determine true north by tracking stars where they cross the meridian. Now, this is Andrew Ellicott's of Baltimore, for whom Ellicott City is named, and was modeled on, this is the one at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian. Now, Bird had made 2 instruments for America. One was for Professor John Winthrop at Harvard, which he did not sign, and which was stolen in the 1970s, and a second he made for the Penns, which was signed. Now that's significant, so keep that in mind. And here's how the instrument worked. It was for determining the meridian, or true north. And so a star went up and a star went down, and by trial and error, you could locate the apex of the orbit, and you could determine true north, and from that you could measure and figure out latitude. Now, this is the instrument that was on the second floor of Independence Hall. It was really a desk ornament in the governor's council chamber, and it was identified as the transit of Venus instrument. Now, it may look a bit weird, but here is its big brother. This is the Taunton transit at the Royal Observatory. And what would happen, this is set exactly, if you've ever been to the Royal Observatory, Greenwich, this is set exactly on the 0 longitude line. And they would figure out what time stars cross the meridian, cross true north, and they would publish it in an ephemeris or an almanac. By taking the time difference in, say, Pennsylvania, when that same star crossed the meridian, you could determine longitude, which was the burning question of the 18th century, because time and longitude, go back, time and longitude are exactly the same thing. When you divide the circle by 360, you get longitude, and when you divide the circle by 24, you get time. So the difference in time between Greenwich and wherever you were when a star crossed the meridian gave you your longitude. But anyhow, I wasn't sure. Stay there a second. I wasn't sure if this what this instrument was, but I thought it was Mason and Dixon's. So I called the curator at Independence Hall, and I said, I think you got Mason and Dixon's instrument. And they said, no, it isn't. It's the Transit of Venus instrument. And I said, no, I think it's the Mason and Dixon instrument. And he said, no, it's the Transit of... And he finally said, well, who the hell are you? You know, and I said, be that as it may, I want to examine it. Okay. They finally got exasperated with me, and they said I could examine it. So I knew it was made by John Bird, the most famous maker, instrument maker of the 18th century, and I examined it. And there on the barrel is John Bird's signature, engraved on the barrel of the instrument. To say, my hair is still standing on end right now as I'm looking at this. To say my hair stood on end would be an understatement. This was the proof that this was the actual instrument used by Mason and Dixon. Now, as Mason and Dixon measured in miles, chains, and lengths, let me digress very briefly to explain 18th century measurement. The Gunter chain was created by Edmund Gunter in 1620 and was the standard distance measuring device for more than 200 years, when it was replaced by the steel tape, which still today is called a chain by surveyors. And each chain was divided into 100 links. This is the first decimal in English imperial measurement. And it was an extremely ingenious device because 80 chains equaled a mile and 10 square chains equaled an acre. And so with one simple instrument, you could measure distance and area at the same time. And an acre traditionally is the amount of land a team of oxen could plow in one day. Now, this is the actual journal of Mason and Dixon. And so I was up in the middle of the night, as I am at my age, and I was just playing around on the internet, and I was looking in the database of the Maryland State Archives. And I came across something that looked very odd. It said, astronomical observations, Mason and Dixon. And I thought to myself, that's really odd. What could that be? So I called the curator, and I went down to Annapolis the next day, and we rooted around in the basement to try and find this document, whatever it was, astronomical observations. Well, we found it, and here it is. And it turns out to be the actual diary and field journal of Mason and Dixon in Jeremiah Dixon's hand. And it's right here in the Maryland State Archives. Now, it contains their daily diary, astronomical observations, calculations, but as well as fascinating observations about the goings-on in colonial America. Now, it's usually pretty dry, surveying calculations and the like, but every now and again, it bursts into poetic imagery. But after meeting with the 12 boundary commissioner for a few days and checking their instruments, The boys began their historic task, which began at the southern, you'll remember, at the southernmost point of Philadelphia on the north wall of a house on Cedar Street, which is now South Street, which had been determined to be the southernmost point. Now, Jim Schomper, who is a Philadelphia regulator, regulators problem is a profession that goes back to colonial times, and they're the official surveyors for Philadelphia, and they are sworn in. But this Philadelphia regulator, by examining old insurance maps, has able to locate the spot of where they actually started the survey, and it's in the bed of I-95, just under the Penn's Landing footbridge. And a couple years ago, a number of us set a point to mark it and put up a plat to mark it in the footbridge. We did not put it in the bed of I-95. Thank you. And there they hired carpenters who constructed a temporary wooden observatory near the house. Now, the observatory probably looks something like this. This is a reconstruction of the observatory used by Mason and Dixon in South Africa during the 1761 transit of Venus observation. But from complex astronomical observations, they were able to determine the latitude of Philadelphia to be 39 degrees, 56 minutes, 29.1 seconds north. Now, this became the reference line, the reference for the east-west line, which had to be 15 miles due south. Now, as going, I prepared this little drawing. If they went, they're in Philadelphia, you can see that at the top of the chart. And if they went 15 miles due south, they would have, oh, great, thank you, Abby. They would have gone across the Delaware River and gone into the province of New Jersey and would have had to deal with the Carterets. So they decided, go up to where the yellow line is. So they decided to go 31 miles due west instead of going down through New Jersey. And they went to the farm of John Harlan in what's now Embryville, Pennsylvania, right near Longwood Gardens, or as they put it, in the Forks of the Brandywine. Now, at the Harlan House, they set up another observatory and a reference stone, next one, and a reference stone, which became known locally as the Stargazers Stone. Okay, and this is the Stargazers stone. It's quartzite, which is probably one of the hardest minerals known, and it's in the cairn. You can see it in the larger slide. It's in the cairn behind the Harlan House, and for many years this was believed to be the location of the observatory that they set up here. But in fact, it wasn't. And they were here, the surveyors were here during the winter, and so the observatory was actually where you might expect it to be. To go to the next slide, it was right outside the kitchen fireplace of the house. And so they would come in and warm themselves up and then run out and take astronomical observations. Now, here I am. We marked the location of the observatory in a ceremony a few years ago, and here I am driving the spike, and there's a little plaque that we set to mark this historic spot of the observatory. Now, there are no known portraits of Mason and Dixon, but this is how they were envisioned quite incorrectly at the Stargazer Stone by artist Brian Tucker. This is how they were pictured more recently, and this picture is in the Maryland Visitors Center just above Frederick on Route 15 at the Pennsylvania line. Now, I hope this is a reasonably correct envisioning of Mason and Dixon, as I consulted on it, and I used their diary to try and figure out exactly what they were doing at this spot in 1762. Now, the surveyors seemed to enjoy their winter in Pennsylvania, and they whiled away, no doubt, many evenings in the local taverns, no doubt sharing political gossips as tension with the mother country rose. Now, tradition has it that they were very serious party animals during the long winter nights in Pennsylvania. One of their supply lists calls for 120 gallons of whiskey, 40 gallons of brandy, and 80 gallons of wine. And remember, this was an all expenses paid gig. Now, in 1764, Abby, can you put your cursor on that yellow line? In the spring of 1764, they're at the Stargazer Stone at the Harland House in Embryville, and they set off exactly 15 miles due south to a point just bear with me. My computer just spazzed. In the spring of 1764, they set off exactly 15 miles due south to a point where they set an oak post, which they called the Post Marked West in Mr. Bryan's field. Next one, Abby. Near what is now Newark, Delaware. And this was to become the starting point of the famous West Line and a reference point for the rest of the survey. As it was used as a base for the calculations which followed, it is mentioned almost daily in their journal, and it's the most significant point in the survey. Over time, the wooden post disappeared, and for 190 years, its location was forgotten and unmarked. And in 1952, this concrete monument was placed on the spot where the post was believed to have been located. However, recent analysis by UPS, which is the blue line on the bottom of this slide. Bear with me a moment.
No worries. And I just want to remind our viewers that they can post any questions they have in our chat.
Over time, the wooden post disappeared, and for nearly 190 years, its location was forgotten. And in 1952, the concrete marker was set. However, we've done some recent analysis, which says that it's not in the correct locations. The blue lines are GPS coordinates of location of the milestones going out 13 miles from the postmarked west. And extrapolating backwards suggests that the actual location was about 27 feet away from the concrete marker. Now, based on these coordinates, I undertook some archaeology to try and find the remains of the original. We were not successful in the first attempt, but have not quite given up. This was my first experience with archaeology, and the digging was really hard work, and I found it needed a lot of supervision. Now, after setting the park most marked west, Mason and Dixon then set south to the middle point of the peninsula that had been previously marked by the colonial surveyors. I'm sorry, I'm having a little computer spaz here. Oh, I might need your help. Oh, I got it. Okay. Following a convenient star, they ran a dead straight line 80 miles from the midpoint, a feat which had never been accomplished before. And by ingeniously proportioning back their error, they were able to set the tangent line. They measured the angle, go to the next slide. They measured the angle at the tangent with their Hadley quadrant, and the angle measured a perfect 90 degrees. And Mason and Dixon had successfully solved the problem that had eluded the colonial surveyors. And on March 11, 1765, a year and a half after their arrival in Philadelphia, they returned to the postmarked west to begin the monumental task of running the West Line. So off they went, hacking their way through the primal forest of Western Maryland. They traveled in wagons, the delicate instruments atop a feather mattress, and as they went, they set stones every mile which had been quarried and sent by ship from England, and then hauled in wagons to Western Maryland. The milestones were marked M on the Maryland side and P on the Pennsylvania side. And they also set crown stones every 5 miles with the coat of arms of the Calverts on one side and the seal of the Penns on the other. And by October 7, 1765, after 9 months of work on the West Line, they had proceeded 117 miles, 12 chains, and 97 links from the postmarked west in Mr. Bryan's field. They stored their instruments and returned back east to the Harlan House and resumed in the spring. Now, amazingly, the western part of the line was not under English sovereignty. It was under Indian sovereignty from the Indian Confederation of the 6 tribes in the Iroquois. It's sometimes called the Iroquois Confederation in upstate New York. And the Mason and Dixon were accompanied by Indian guides, and the Indian guides came to, bear with me, what was known as the warpath, and this was the most important Indian trail in the country. It went from upstate New York to South Carolina. It was sort of an Indian I-95, and the chief of the Indians informed the surveyors that the warpath was the limit of his commission from the chiefs of the 6 nations, and they would proceed not one step further westward. And so the line was extended an additional 250 feet to the top of the next ridge, Brown's Hill, and after setting up a tall post and a conical mound, 233 miles, 17 chains, and 48 links from the postmarked west in Mr. Bryan's field, the Mason-Dixon line came to an end. At the conclusion of the work, Mason and Dixon returned to Philadelphia and were instructed to draw a map of their survey, of which 200 copies were printed. Only a handful are known to still exist. There are only 3 copies extant, which are signed and sealed by the 12 boundary commissioners. 2 of them are right here in Baltimore. The seals look like they were affixed this morning. The magnitude of the Mason and Dixon accomplishments is almost unimaginable. They spent nearly 5 years in America, living in tents and enduring searing summers and frigid winters. And their line has been surveyed many times, and the accuracy which they achieved, given the technology of their day, continues to astound. They did not understand that the pull of gravity from nearby mountains would affect their plumb bobs, and had they understood that, their error probably would have been less than 50 feet. Now, many wonder how much they were paid. Believe it or not, this is the actual bill for the Mason-Dixon survey. They were paid £3,516, 9 shillings, and no pence. It's very difficult to calculate what that would be in today's dollars. However, we would estimate that the total is somewhere around 200,000 pounds, or roughly $300,000 at today's exchange rate, maybe $60,000 a year. A decent salary, but certainly not great considering the groundbreaking nature of their effort. Now, on September 11, 1768, their work complete, Mason and Dixon left for home. Mason left for home, and he wrote in his journal, at 11:30, I boarded the Halifax packet boat for Falmouth. Thus ends my restless progress in America. Now, Mason, who happened to be a Mason, I might add, returned to America in 1786 with his wife and 8 children. And in September, he wrote to Benjamin Franklin, also a Mason, that he was ill and confined to bed. He died shortly thereafter and is buried in an unmarked grave in the Christ Church burial ground in Philadelphia. I strongly suggest Franklin paid for the funeral. Dixon went back to County Durham, England, where he had a very prosperous career, this being the time of the boundary laws, and he died young in 1779. Now, although he had been thrown out of the Quaker church for, quote, drinking and excessive womanizing, he must have reconciled because he is buried in an unmarked grave behind the old Frederick Meeting House in Staindrop, England, now a private residence. Now there was, this is the beautiful garden he's buried in. I had to hop the wall. It's a private garden, but I hopped the wall anyway to get this picture and to pay my respects. Now, while Mason and Dixon passed on to that great beyond, their line lived on. In 1820, Congress adopted the Missouri Compromise and first used the term Mason-Dixon line to describe the Maryland-Pennsylvania border. States north of the Mason-Dixon line generally, a couple exceptions, were to be free, and those south were slave states. And so in addition to being the first geodetic survey in America and one of the greatest scientific achievements of all time, the Mason-Dixon line became an icon, the dividing line between slavery and freedom. Now, although Mason and Dixon returned to England, the bird instrument, which belonged to the Penns, remained behind. An observatory was constructed by the American Philosophical Society on the grounds of the Pennsylvania State House, which we now know as Independence Hall. As the observatory cost 60 pounds, perhaps $9,000 in today's dollars, it must have been rather substantial. The instruments, so the observatory is right behind us in this spot. Nobody knows exactly where it is, but is in this spot behind Independence Hall. And the instruments were stored inside, and the second transit of Venus observation was successfully concluded there by the American Philosophical Society on June 3rd, 1769, to great acclaim for the prowess of the American scientist. Now, the observatory had steps and sort of a stage. You may have had 3 steps and a stage on it. And being on the grounds of the State House, it provided a very convenient spot from which public announcements were made during the unrest leading up to the Revolution. For instance, the protests against the hated Stamp Act. Now, it was from these steps on July 8th, 1776, that Colonel John Dixon of the Pennsylvania Committee of Safety first proclaimed the Declaration of Independence to a thronging crowd with the bird instrument stored behind it. And so there are only 2 artifacts believed to be extant from the first proclamation of the Declaration of Independence, and the bird transit is one of them. Now, bear with me just a moment. Dr. Silvio Bedini, an eminent scientist, was the late curator of instruments at the Smithsonian. And he told the story of how the bird transit was unexpectedly discovered in 1912 in the bell tower of Independence Hall in an article entitled "The Transit in the Tower," published in the Annals of Science, an eminent journal. And he based his account on a newspaper article by Eric Doolittle, the director of the Flower Observatory at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Bedini stated that during renovations to the bell tower directed by then curator Wilfred Jordan, floorboards were removed near the old supports of the Liberty Bell, and to great surprise, the bird instrument was discovered packed away in a box. Bedini theorized that when Philadelphia was occupied by Lord Howe after the Battle of Brandywine in 1777, panic ensued, and items that were of use to the enemy were hidden away. Now, while this story is wonderfully romantic, it is surely wrong. First of all, it's implausible. Independence Hall is the most studied building in America, and it's unlikely that a transit could be hidden there for 135 years. Second, a delicate astronomical instrument had no military value to the British, but most persuasively, I found a letter from Andrew Ellicott, Surveyor General of the United States and a Baltimorean, stating that in 1784, long after the survey, he and David Rittenhouse used the Penn instruments to complete the westward extension of the Mason-Dixon line and to run the western border of Pennsylvania up to Lake Erie. Now, frankly, I was quite skeptical of this whole story. It definitely had the smell of cherry tree to it. It definitely had a whiff of cherry tree to this. I strongly suspected false provenance or fraudulent provenance, with which I have had some experience. So independent. Well, look at this. Look at this picture. This is the south facade of Independence Hall. There's an anachronism in this picture. Can anybody spot it? Something is wrong in this picture. Can anybody spot it? Well, it's that bow window just above the oculus and just below the clock face, because the building is 1732 and bow windows weren't invented till about 1880. There's something wrong here. So now Independence Hall is a target of opportunity. Go back one. Independence Hall is a target of terrorist opportunity. It is extremely, it's like the White House. It's extremely heavily guarded. You can only visit the first floor on timed tours. The second floor, the Governor's Council chamber, is rarely open, and nobody goes into the bell tower. Not even the president can go into the bell tower. So I go into the bell tower where the instrument was supposedly found, and I saw that it had been mounted on the stone sill of this south-facing window, this bow window in the tower. Just bear with me a moment. Oh, I'm just having a little computer trouble here. So I went to the boat. I went up in the bell tower where the instrument was supposedly found, and I found that it had been mounted on the stone sill of the south window of the tower. Now the window, the window is a bow window, and as I mentioned, it's very odd because bow windows weren't invented until about the 1880s or so. They were usually used on the first floor in commercial applications, and also this particular bow window opens out, and bow windows open in to protect the top stile from the weather. And a careful examination of the sill below the window, this is the window, and this is what's below the window. revealed eccentric holes, which suggested that there had been a mounting bracket here. And I stared at it, and I stared at it, puzzled. And I also had a compass in my pocket, being a surveyor, and I realized that this window was facing due south. But finally, the light bulb went off. As I was standing there, the works of the clock tower were directly behind the window on this level, and the answer finally occurred to me. The midday sun was perfectly framed by the window, and the instrument must have been used to obtain noon at Philadelphia and to calibrate the tower clock prior to the standardization of railroads in 1883. Before the standardization of time by the railroads, every town had its own noon, and the biggest clock in town would be used to set everybody's little clocks and watches. So it became clear to me that that the instrument was mounted in the bow window, and it was used to determine noon and to set the clock. And so I believe the discovery in 1912 was very plausible and probably true. Now, after the instrument was no longer needed, it was probably stowed in a box by a municipal worker until it was discovered many years later. Now, as an aside, in the corner of the tower was this gnarly green braided copper wire. It was green with oxidation, and I stared at it for a moment, and then I realized what it was. It was Ben Franklin's original lightning rod. Now, as a further aside, I was sitting on a pile of old wood as I was taking notes as the curator was explaining the history to me, and then she said, "Oh, David, dear, do be careful. You're sitting on the original supports to the Liberty Bell." And I didn't notice this sign which says, "Don't put your big butt here because this is a historic object." But for whatever the reason, the little transit, which we discovered, is arguably America's most historic scientific instrument. It was witness to three of the seminal events in American history: the survey of the Mason-Dixon line, the 1769 transit of Venus observation, and the very first proclamation of the Declaration of Independence. But that's where we were a few years ago. Now, the instrument was in terrible shape, and this is what it looked like at the time: just a telescope, trunnion axle, and a hanging level. It was displayed rather forlornly on a felt cloth on a table in the governor's council chamber, and it couldn't really be understood or appreciated by visitors. And so I decided to I decided to restore it. And I thought what I would do. The restoration and the conservation was fairly expensive, but I could have afforded it, I thought. And I thought it would be pretty cool to have maybe a plaque in Independence Hall saying, like David Rubenstein, saying restored by David Thaler. And Mrs. Thaler, a lawyer, an administrative law judge, came to me and said, "What, are you crazy?" Says, "You need to engage other people." And so she was absolutely right. So I ran a nationwide fundraising campaign called Save Mason and Dixon's Instrument, and it resonated with surveyors all over the country. And some people donated $100, and some people donated $10,000, and we gave everybody credit for it. And we engaged them all in this restoration process. And the restoration itself was based on two instruments. This is the John Bird Transit on the left in the collection of the Dresden State Art Collection in Dresden, Germany. And the one on the right is the Bird instrument at Harvard prior to its theft. Both instruments were designed for stationary observatory use, and the tripod for field use was based upon the Andrew Ellicott instrument at the National Museum of American History. The counterpoise protractor and the intricate micrometer controls were based upon the two surviving instruments. So here it is, the fully restored instrument as it would have appeared when Mason and Dixon first used it. Here I am in Independence Hall just after the completion of the restoration. And here are my wife Carolyn and I, go back here in Baltimore, where we unveiled it in a big ceremony at the Maryland Historical Society and presented it as a gift to the nation from the surveyors of America. There is one other thing I want to mention, and that is in 1859, a new song closed a minstrel show in New York. The song was by Daniel Emmett, and it was called "I Wish I Was in Dixie's Land," and it was wildly successful at the time, really swept the country. This was before copyrights, and it was basically stolen, and it was reprinted sometimes as Dixon's, next one, Abby, as Dixon's Line, Dixieland. But the term Dixie, as in the Confederate States, the land of Dixie, has absolutely nothing to do with Jeremiah Dixon, but not many people understand that. This is the $10 banknote of the Bank of New Orleans, and on the back it says D-I-X 10 in French, of course, and these notes were called Dixies. And New Orleans was termed the land of Dixie, and the South became the land of Dixie, but it has absolutely nothing to do with Mason or Dixon. I was hoping that this conference would be in person and I could see some of my old friends with whom I've worked for all these years, and we could adjourn to the bar and have a little bit of a happy hour together. But I'm sorry I'm not with you, but if you go home tonight, I'd like you to ponder the amazing achievement of the young surveyors on the American frontier in the 1760s. Thank you very much. It has been my honor to present to the Land Use Institute. Judge Leahy?
That was fantastic, David. Thank you so much. I know that Peter wanted to say a few words in closing. Thank you, my friend. That was wonderful.
If you want me to take questions, if you have time, I'll be happy to.
First, thank you, David, for hanging around all day to present. Of course, Judge Leahy was right that it was worth the wait. And on behalf of the Land Use Institute Planning Committee and on behalf of my co-chair, Casey Cerner, I want to thank all of you for joining us for the 2021 Land Use Institute. And we also want to thank all of our talented panelists and our moderators, including the appellate judges. And we want to give a special thank you to Patty Sulkin, who went above and beyond what was ever expected by pre-recording her 45-minute presentation that she had planned to give live at 3 a.m. In the airport after her airplane made an emergency landing. And then somehow she was able to log back on in time after catching another flight to answer questions. And we are already looking forward to getting together in person in 2023. And again, if you would like to join the 2023 Planning Committee, please send me an email at peter.goldsmith@mncppc.org or Casey at ccerner@milesstockbridge.com. The MSBA will be emailing surveys to all of you, and we would appreciate your feedback. And so with that said, we all hope you have a wonderful evening, and I hope that we can all get together soon. Have a great night.
Thank you.